let's put all this in context. Has federal borrowing been larger or smaller than private borrowing? How large is private borrowing lately? You gave me the number.
2.1
2.1 what?
trillion.
Trillion. How large is federal borrowing?
2.5.
No.
About 2.5.
Wait a minute. I said borrowing. I didn't say revenues or expenditures. I said borrowing. How large is federal borrowing?
250 billion.
Much smaller, right? The federal borrowing is maybe 1/10 of the private. So it's much smaller. Does everybody understand that? Putting them on the equivalent basis, much smaller, and therefore has a much smaller impact. Does everybody see that? So that's the first thing. For the federal borrowing to have as large an impact as the private borrowing, it would have to be as large, and it's not. You may remember that once upon a time, people used to talk about federal borrowing and inflation. Why? Why? Because once upon a time, and by once upon a time I mean even before I was born, the only kind of borrowing was of any real size was federal borrowing. When did it happen? During wartime. And during wartime, there was Civil War, World War I, for instance, World War II. There was massive federal borrowing, massive federal spending, and inflation. And so the common wisdom, the conventional wisdom, federal deficits generate inflation. And it was true, because the federal deficits, the federal borrowing, the federal spending grew disproportionately large during those periods. You may ask, well, what about the private borrowing? Well, the private borrowing in those days was very small because we didn't have the institutions to support private borrowing. Let me give you an example. Today, as you know, if you want to borrow to buy a home, very little down payment, sometimes none at all is required. Your loan is going to be amortized. That is, you pay principal as well as interest. And the term of the loan can be stretched out over 30 years. Once upon a time, like 80 years ago or 100 years ago, if you wanted to borrow to buy a house, the down payment was very large, maybe half the value of the property or more. The term of the loan was short, maybe 10 years, and no amortization. So you paid interest only and then paid a huge balloon payment of the entire principal at the end. So you had to establish your own sinking fund. You had to save the amount of the principal as you went each month, and so at the end you could pay off the loan. It was much harder to buy a home because you couldn't borrow. And as a matter of fact, 80 years ago, when the nation was far more rural than it is today, only about half of American households owned their own homes. Now, only half owned their own homes 80 years ago. Today, 2/3 own their own homes. Why? Because what happened was we liberalized, through federal policy, the mortgage borrowing. During the 1930s, in order to stimulate the economy, the Federal Housing Administration was created, and it began to insure mortgages. So the banks didn't have to worry about the borrower defaulting. And the FHA mortgages were made very, very attractive. Long payments, like 20 years, small down payments, like 10%, and amortization. And after World War II, the private lenders picked that up as normal. And so now there's 30 years of payment. Does everybody understand? And so the monthly payment shrank, and it put a home in front of everybody's reach. And so now the private borrowing grew and grew. Private borrowing had never been a substantial portion of total borrowing before. And now it grew until it was really substantial. What about car loans? Same thing. After World War II, maximum term of an automobile loan, 24 months. Nowadays, 60 months, more. The whole point, lengthen the loan, reduce the size of the monthly payment. And now, as you know, there's second mortgage loans and so forth. And so government borrowing has paled in proportion to private borrowing. See? And so that's why the federal borrowing, we no longer look at that as a source of inflation, because it's the private borrowing which has become the real driving force behind spending.
Why do people still concentrate a lot on the federal?
The reason that people concentrate on the federal is one, tradition, because of that nostalgic association with the notion that federal deficits cause inflation, although it's nostalgic really. Federal borrowing is small now compared to private. And second of all, because of the political argument about tax cuts and stimulus to the economy in general. Even though the federal borrowing and spending is relatively small, there's that tradition of Keynesianism. Remember when it originated in the 1930s. And then there's the response to it, which was supply side.